You ever hear someone call 911 over the smell of barbecue? I have, because it happened to my family on a warm Saturday afternoon, and before the day was over, one phone call would expose far more about my wealthy neighbor than it ever revealed about us. My name is Grant Walker, and if you had driven past my house that afternoon, you would have seen exactly what you would expect in any quiet American neighborhood during the summer. My wife had burgers sizzling on the grill. My brother was laughing while trying to keep my nephews from stealing hot dogs before they were ready. My daughter had a speaker playing classic soul music at a respectful volume, and our closest friends were gathered beneath the shade of two large oak trees in the backyard. It was not a holiday. It was not a special event. We simply believed life moved too fast, and every now and then you needed to slow down long enough to share a meal with the people who mattered most. Our backyard backed up to a decorative fence that separated our property from the estate next door, where Victoria Ashcroft lived alone in a house that looked more like a boutique hotel than a family home. Every inch of her landscaping looked professionally maintained. Every flower seemed arranged with a ruler, and every vehicle parked in her circular driveway cost more than many people earned in a year. Around the neighborhood, everyone knew Victoria appreciated appearances more than conversations. She rarely greeted anyone, but she noticed everything. If a trash can stayed outside an hour too long, she noticed. If someone parked a pickup truck on the street overnight, she noticed. If children laughed too loudly while riding bicycles, she definitely noticed. Most people simply learned to ignore her, and until that Saturday, so had I. The afternoon sun was bright without being unbearable, hovering somewhere in the mid-80s, and a gentle breeze carried the smell of smoked ribs across the fence. My father leaned back in his lawn chair with the content expression of a man who had finally retired after decades of honest work. My mother kept insisting everyone eat more potato salad. It felt ordinary in the best possible way. Then the music stopped. My daughter looked down at her phone, confused. Someone had connected to the speaker system without permission before immediately disconnecting. A few seconds later, we heard a loud voice from the other side of the fence. "This neighborhood is not your personal park," a woman shouted. I recognized Victoria immediately. Nobody answered. My wife simply lowered the grill lid and whispered that maybe she would go back inside if things became uncomfortable. I smiled and told her there was nothing to worry about. We were on our own property. We were following every local noise ordinance. We had not blocked the street, filled the sidewalk, or disturbed anyone beyond the ordinary sounds of families enjoying a weekend. Silence returned for almost a minute before Victoria appeared around the side of the fence near the front yard. She was dressed in an expensive designer outfit that looked far too formal for a summer afternoon, oversized sunglasses resting on perfectly styled hair. She never stepped onto my lawn, but she stood just close enough for everyone to hear her. She slowly looked over our guests as if inspecting a problem that needed to be corrected. "I have asked you people before to keep it down," she announced loudly, even though nobody could remember her ever speaking to us about a barbecue. My brother politely replied, "Ma'am, we're just having lunch with family." Instead of answering him, she pulled out her phone. She held it high, pointed the camera toward our backyard, and began recording without saying another word. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable looks. My mother quietly asked whether we should all move inside. I shook my head. There was nothing to hide. Victoria tapped her screen several times before lifting the phone to her ear. Even from where I stood beside the grill, I could hear her voice become dramatically louder than necessary. "Yes," she said into the phone. "I'd like to report a disturbance. There is a large group creating an unsafe situation in the neighborhood. They are refusing to cooperate, and I feel threatened." My wife looked at me with concern. My father slowly stood from his chair. My daughter whispered that none of this made any sense. I kept my expression calm because I had spent enough years understanding that panic never improved a situation. Still, as the distant sound of approaching sirens floated through the neighborhood only a few minutes later, I realized our peaceful Saturday had just become something none of us would ever forget. The flashing lights reflected off the windows of every house on the street long before the patrol car reached my driveway. Conversations around the picnic tables faded into nervous silence as two uniformed officers stepped out of their cruiser with calm, professional expressions that immediately told me they were treating the call as a routine response rather than an emergency. I walked toward the front of my property before either officer had to ask, keeping my hands visible and offering a polite smile. "Good afternoon, officers," I said. "I am Grant Walker. How can I help you today?" The older of the two officers returned the greeting with an easy nod. "Good afternoon, sir. We received a complaint about a disturbance. We just need to see what is going on." "Absolutely," I replied. "You are welcome to take a look around." Behind me, my family continued standing quietly in the backyard exactly where they had been moments earlier. Nobody shouted. Nobody argued. My wife simply turned the grill down so nothing would burn while my father folded his lawn chair and placed it beside the table. The younger officer glanced across the yard, taking in children tossing a football, grandparents talking beneath the trees, and friends waiting with paper plates in their hands. His expression softened almost immediately. "Looks like a family barbecue," he said quietly to his partner. Before either of them could continue, Victoria Ashcroft marched across her perfectly trimmed lawn with determined steps, waving one hand dramatically in the air while clutching her phone in the other. "Officers," she called out before reaching them. "Finally, I have been trying to explain that these people have taken over the neighborhood all afternoon." Neither officer interrupted her. They simply listened while maintaining neutral expressions. Victoria pointed toward my backyard without even looking at me. "The music has been blaring for hours. There are far too many people here. They have made everyone around them uncomfortable." I asked them politely to stop, and they ignored me completely. I waited until she finished before speaking. "Officer, our music has been at a normal volume all afternoon. We have been inside our own property the entire time, and we have not blocked traffic or disturbed anyone intentionally." The older officer looked toward the portable speaker sitting near the patio table. "Would you mind turning it on for a moment?" My daughter pressed play. Soft music drifted across the backyard, quiet enough that conversation easily covered it. The officer walked halfway down the driveway, paused, then turned back toward us. "That volume seems reasonable," he said. Victoria folded her arms immediately. "That is because they turned it down when they saw you arrive." The younger officer politely asked, "Do you have any evidence that it was significantly louder earlier?" Victoria hesitated for only a second before raising her phone. "I recorded everything." She confidently opened the video she had taken only minutes earlier. We all stood silently while she pressed play. Ironically, the recording captured exactly what had been happening before the officers arrived. My mother could be heard laughing. My nephew was asking for another hamburger. Someone joked about burning the corn on the grill. The music played quietly in the background, barely noticeable. There was no shouting, no argument, and certainly nothing suggesting a dangerous situation. Victoria quickly stopped the video before it reached the end. "Well, it was louder before I started recording," she insisted. The older officer remained courteous. "Ma'am, we can only evaluate what we can observe and verify." She looked visibly frustrated that the evidence she believed would support her complaint had done the opposite. "You are missing the point," she said. "This neighborhood has standards." My brother answered respectfully before I could. "We are simply spending time with our family on a Saturday." Victoria ignored him completely and continued speaking only to the officers. "There are too many cars parked here." The younger officer glanced toward the curb. Every vehicle was legally parked with clear access to fire hydrants and driveways. "Everything appears compliant," he replied. Victoria took a deep breath, clearly expecting the officers to agree with her authority without question. Instead, they continued examining the situation with patience and professionalism. I appreciated that more than she realized. Good policing begins with facts, not assumptions. The older officer turned back toward me. "Sir, thank you for cooperating. We may have just a few more routine questions before we clear the call." I smiled and nodded without revealing anything more about myself. I had no intention of mentioning my profession. Today was not about who I was. It was about allowing the process to work exactly as it was designed, because sometimes the clearest truth reveals itself only after everyone has finished making assumptions. The older officer took out a small notepad while his partner continued looking around the property with quiet attention. Neither of them appeared rushed, and that seemed to frustrate Victoria even more than if they had disagreed with her outright. She shifted her weight impatiently before speaking again. "Why are you still asking questions? Just tell them to end this gathering and send everyone home." The older officer answered in the same calm tone he had used from the beginning. "Ma'am, we are here to determine whether any law or ordinance has been violated. That requires us to gather information first." Victoria let out a short laugh that sounded more irritated than amused. Information? You have eyes. Look around. The younger officer did exactly that. He counted the vehicles parked legally along the curb. He glanced at the grill, the folding tables, and the children now quietly coloring at a picnic table after sensing the tension around them. He looked toward neighboring houses where several residents had stepped onto their porches out of curiosity. None of them appeared upset. In fact, one elderly couple offered a friendly wave in my direction before returning inside. "Sir," the younger officer asked me politely, "approximately how many guests do you have today?" "About 20, I answered honestly. "Mostly family, along with a few close friends we have known for years." He nodded and wrote it down. "Have you received any complaints before today?" "No, officer." Before he could ask another question, Victoria stepped directly into the conversation again. "That is because people around here are too polite to say anything. I am the only one willing to protect the standards of this neighborhood." I noticed several of my guests exchange puzzled looks. My father quietly leaned toward me and whispered, "She seems more interested in winning an argument than solving a problem." I smiled slightly but kept my attention on the officers. They deserved my full cooperation, and I intended to give it. The older officer turned toward Victoria once more. "Ma'am, besides the noise concern, is there anything specific that made you believe there was an emergency requiring a call to 911? She hesitated for a moment before answering. I felt intimidated. "Did anyone threaten you?" he asked. "No." "Did anyone approach your property?" "No." "Did anyone attempt to enter your home?" "No." "Has anyone refused a lawful request from law enforcement today?" "Well, you just arrived." The officer nodded thoughtfully, but wrote nothing down. The silence that followed seemed louder than any music from the barbecue. Even Victoria appeared to realize her answers were not supporting the urgency of her original report. Still, she refused to let the matter go. She lifted her phone again, this time opening a neighborhood social media page. "Look," she said, showing the screen to the officers. "I already warned everyone that this situation was getting out of control." The younger officer glanced briefly at the post before handing the phone back. "Ma'am, social media comments are not evidence of a violation." Her face tightened with disbelief. "You cannot be serious." "We have to rely on observable facts," he replied. Meanwhile, my wife quietly carried fresh lemonade onto the patio table for our guests, making sure nobody wandered into the officer's workspace. One of our friends asked if the gathering should end early. I shook my head gently. "Not unless they ask us to." The officers noticed that simple exchange, and I could tell they appreciated everyone remaining respectful. The atmosphere stayed calm despite the unexpected interruption. Then something unexpected happened. A delivery driver pulled into the neighborhood, slowed near my driveway, and rolled down his window. "Everything all right here?" he asked casually after recognizing me from previous deliveries. "Everything is fine," I answered with a smile. He nodded, wished everyone a good afternoon, and continued on his route. It was another ordinary interaction that quietly reinforced the reality of what this day truly was: a peaceful family gathering interrupted by assumptions. Victoria watched the exchange with growing frustration. She seemed convinced that if she kept pushing hard enough, someone would eventually agree with her version of events. Instead, every passing minute produced another ordinary detail that contradicted her claims. I remained exactly where I was, saying only what was necessary, because experience had taught me something long before this afternoon. When people are determined to prove themselves right, the most powerful response is often to let the facts keep speaking for themselves. The older officer closed his notepad for a moment and thanked everyone for remaining patient. He explained that, based on everything he had observed so far, there was no indication that anyone at the gathering had violated a law or created the type of disturbance described in the emergency call. I could almost feel the tension begin to leave my family's shoulders. My mother quietly returned to arranging food on the picnic table, and my brother finally let out the breath he had been holding since the patrol car arrived. Victoria, however, reacted as though she had just been told something impossible. "You cannot simply walk away," she insisted. "You have not even checked who these people are." The younger officer answered politely, "Ma'am, we have identified the homeowner, spoken with the parties involved, and observed the situation ourselves." She immediately pointed toward me. "Then run his information again. There has to be something you are missing." I stood calmly without responding. There was no reason to argue. The officers had been respectful from the beginning, and I intended to return that respect by allowing them to finish their work without interference. The older officer looked at me. "Sir, would you mind providing your driver's license so we can complete our report?" "Of course," I replied. I reached slowly into my back pocket, removed my wallet, and handed him my license. He thanked me and stepped a few feet away while his partner remained near the driveway. Victoria folded her arms with a satisfied smile, clearly believing the conversation had finally turned in her favor. She watched every movement as the officer compared the identification with the information on his tablet. A few seconds passed. Then I noticed something subtle. The younger officer glanced toward his partner's screen, looked back at me, and paused for just a fraction longer than before. He did not say a word. His expression remained professional, but I could tell he had recognized something. The older officer finished reviewing the information, handed my license back with a courteous smile, and simply said, "Thank you, Mr. Walker." Nothing else changed. There was no sudden shift in tone, no dramatic announcement, and certainly no special treatment. That seemed to confuse Victoria more than anything else. She took a step closer. "Well," she demanded, "what did you find?" The officer answered calmly, "We completed the identification process." "And," she pressed, "everything is in order." Her confidence faded for the first time that afternoon. She had expected the routine identification to reveal some hidden problem, but instead it had produced exactly what every other part of the investigation had produced, nothing supporting her accusations. The younger officer then asked me one final routine question. "Mr. Walker, approximately how much longer do you expect the gathering to continue?" "Probably another couple of hours," I answered. "Most of the family plans to leave before sunset so everyone can get home at a reasonable time." He nodded. "That sounds perfectly reasonable." Victoria shook her head in disbelief. "So you are actually allowing this?" The older officer responded with remarkable patience. "Ma'am, at this time we have no lawful basis to require them to end a private family gathering." She opened her mouth to argue again, but stopped herself. Several nearby neighbors had quietly gathered on their front lawns while pretending to water flowers or check their mail. None of them appeared alarmed. In fact, a few offered friendly smiles toward my family, making it increasingly obvious that the emergency call reflected one person's opinion rather than the neighborhood's reality. I accepted my driver's license, thanked both officers for their professionalism, and slipped my wallet back into my pocket. I still chose not to mention my position or explain why one of the officers had briefly recognized my name. Today was not about titles. It was about allowing fairness to work exactly as it should. As the officers prepared to wrap up the call, Victoria reached for her phone once again with a determined expression that suggested she was not ready to accept the outcome. I had a feeling the afternoon was far from over, because some people find it easier to invent a new complaint than to admit the first one was wrong. Victoria stared at her phone for several long seconds before tapping the screen with renewed determination. "Fine," she said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "If the first report did not explain the situation properly, I will make sure the next one does." The older officer raised a hand politely. "Ma'am, there is no need to place another emergency call while we are already on scene." She stopped dialing but continued speaking with visible frustration. "Then somebody higher up needs to know what is happening here." I remained where I was beside the driveway, resisting every temptation to respond emotionally. My father had always taught me that when someone desperately wanted a reaction, the greatest advantage was staying calm. My family followed the same example. My wife quietly offered bottled water to our guests. My brother helped clear a few empty plates from the picnic table, and my daughter lowered the music even further even though the officers had already confirmed the volume was reasonable. The atmosphere could not have looked more peaceful. The younger officer took one more slow look around the property before glancing at the tablet in his hand again. His eyes briefly met mine. This time there was unmistakable recognition. He looked back at the screen, then toward his partner, who noticed the expression immediately. Without saying a word, the younger officer stepped closer and quietly pointed to a line on the display. The conversation between them was barely more than a whisper, completely professional and impossible for anyone else to hear. The older officer's eyebrows lifted slightly before he looked back at me with the same respectful expression he had shown from the beginning. Nothing about his demeanor changed except for one subtle detail. He now addressed me with even greater care, not because of authority, but because he understood exactly who I was. He walked over and handed me a small card containing the incident number. Mr. Walker, thank you again for your cooperation today. We appreciate how patient you and your family have been. I accepted the card with a smile. Thank you, officer. You both handled the situation professionally. Victoria immediately stepped between us. Handled what professionally? They have not handled anything. She pointed directly at me. Tell them who you really are. I could tell she assumed I had hidden something serious. Instead, I simply answered, I am exactly who I told them I was. My name is Grant Walker, and this is my home. The older officer spoke before Victoria could continue. Ma'am, we have verified Mr. Walker's identity. She folded her arms. Then tell me why you suddenly changed your attitude. The officer remained composed. Our attitude has not changed. We have followed the same procedure from the moment we arrived. That answer only seemed to deepen her confusion. She had expected some dramatic confrontation or secret revelation, but the officers continued treating everyone equally. Meanwhile, a neighbor from across the street slowly walked over carrying a pie covered with aluminum foil. Mrs. Henderson smiled warmly at my wife. I was planning to bring this over anyway, she said. I hope I am not interrupting. My wife laughed softly. Not at all. Thank you. Mrs. Henderson turned toward the officers. For what it is worth, officer, I have lived across from Grant's family for 6 years. They are wonderful neighbors. This is probably the quietest barbecue I have ever attended without actually being invited. Even the younger officer smiled at that. Victoria looked around and seemed genuinely surprised that nobody nearby was supporting her version of events. One by one, the assumptions she had built throughout the afternoon were quietly collapsing under ordinary facts, calm witnesses, and simple observations. I still chose not to mention my position within the police department because I wanted the outcome to stand entirely on its own. If the truth required a title to be believed, then it was never strong enough in the first place. As the officers prepared to return to their patrol car, the younger officer paused beside me just long enough to speak in a voice only I could hear. Chief, thank you for letting us handle this exactly by the book. I nodded almost imperceptibly before answering, just as quietly. That is the only way it should ever be done. Neither of us realized that someone standing only a few feet away had just overheard enough of that brief exchange to change everything that would happen next. The younger officer had barely taken 2 steps toward the patrol car when Victoria's voice cut through the quiet afternoon once again. Chief, she repeated loudly, turning toward me with a mixture of confusion and disbelief. Did he just call you Chief? Both officers stopped walking at exactly the same moment. The younger officer looked genuinely uncomfortable, realizing he had spoken a little louder than intended. The older officer remained composed, but I could tell he understood the situation had just changed. I took a slow breath before answering. Yes, I said calmly. I serve as the police chief for this city. For several seconds, nobody spoke. My family already knew my career had nothing to do with why we were standing there, so they simply watched in silence. Victoria, however, stared at me as though the answer did not fit the story she had spent the entire afternoon creating. You expect me to believe that? She asked. The older officer answered before I needed to. Ma'am, that information is accurate. She looked from him to me and back again. Then why did nobody tell me? I smiled politely. Because it was never relevant to the call. She shook her head. It changes everything. Actually, I replied, it changes nothing. The officers responded exactly as they should have. They evaluated the facts, not the person. The older officer nodded in agreement. That is correct. For the first time since the patrol car arrived, Victoria seemed unsure of what to say next. She had spent the afternoon insisting that authority should immediately support her conclusions. Instead, the very authority she trusted had reached the opposite conclusion by following standard procedure. Rather than accepting that reality, she searched for another explanation. This is why they took your side, she insisted. The younger officer answered respectfully but firmly. Ma'am, with respect, we did not know who Mr. Walker was when we arrived. We spoke with everyone, examined the complaint, observed the property, and reached our conclusion before recognizing his position. The older officer added, our report reflects exactly what we observed. It would have been the same regardless of anyone's occupation. I appreciated those words because they reflected the principles I had spent years trying to build within the department. Public trust depended on consistency, not special treatment. Mrs. Henderson, still holding the empty pie dish my wife had returned to her, smiled gently. That is exactly why our neighborhood respects these officers, she said. A few other neighbors quietly nodded in agreement. Victoria looked around and realized she no longer had an audience willing to validate her assumptions. Instead of sympathy, she found people who had witnessed a calm family gathering interrupted by an unnecessary emergency call. Still unwilling to let the matter rest, she lifted her phone once more. I will file a complaint about this entire response, she announced. The older officer answered without hesitation. You absolutely have that right, ma'am. If you would like to file a complaint or request a supervisor's review, the process is available to every resident. We will gladly provide the information. His response seemed to catch her off guard because it removed any suggestion that someone was preventing her from being heard. She lowered the phone slightly, but continued searching for another argument. So nobody is going to do anything? She asked. We have done our job, the older officer replied. We investigated the reported concern, documented our findings, and determined there was no violation requiring enforcement. I stepped forward just enough to address her directly, keeping my voice even and respectful. Victoria, I truly hope the next time you have concerns about something happening next door, you will consider walking over and having a conversation before assuming the worst. She looked at me for a long moment, but offered no response. Sometimes silence reveals more than an argument ever could. The officers thanked everyone again for their cooperation and finally returned to their patrol car. As they drove away, the neighborhood slowly settled back into its usual rhythm. Guests returned to their conversations, children resumed tossing the football across the lawn, and my wife reopened the grill to finish cooking the last few burgers. From a distance, it probably looked like an ordinary Saturday had resumed. But I had a feeling the events of that afternoon were only beginning to unfold, because emergency calls, official reports, and public records often leave behind a trail of facts that continues long after the flashing lights disappear. The smell of fresh barbecue slowly replaced the scent of warm pavement left behind by the patrol car, and for the first time all afternoon, genuine laughter returned to my backyard. My brother flipped another rack of ribs onto the grill, while my mother insisted everyone take another helping of baked beans, almost as if feeding people was her way of restoring normal life. I wanted that feeling just as much as everyone else did, but years in law enforcement had taught me something important. Incidents rarely ended when the police left. They usually continued through conversations, reports, and the choices people made afterward. About 30 minutes later, I noticed Victoria standing behind the large front window of her house, staring toward our property. She was no longer recording with her phone. Instead, she seemed to be watching every visitor who walked through our gate, almost trying to convince herself she had missed something important. I decided not to pay attention. My family deserved the rest of their afternoon without another confrontation. Mrs. Henderson eventually joined us for a slice of pie, laughing as she admitted she had originally walked over simply because she thought the desserts looked too good to ignore. Two other neighbors stopped by as well, not because they wanted to discuss the earlier incident, but because they wanted to reassure my parents that they had never viewed our gathering as a problem. Those simple conversations meant more to me than any official report. Communities are built through ordinary acts of trust, not dramatic moments. As the afternoon drifted toward evening, several guests began packing folding chairs into their vehicles. Children chased one another across the yard while adults exchanged hugs and promises to get together again before summer ended. It looked exactly the way I had hoped the day would end when I first lit the grill. Then my phone vibrated inside my pocket. It was not an emergency call. It was a message from the city's on-duty watch commander. He had already seen the incident report submitted by the responding officers. The message was brief. Everything handled professionally. No action required. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, Chief. I smiled, slipped the phone back into my pocket, and said nothing. My family did not need to spend the evening talking about work. My wife noticed the expression on my face and quietly asked, "Good news?" "Just confirmation that everything was handled correctly," I answered. She squeezed my hand without asking another question. That was one of the things I admired most about her. She understood that some conversations belonged at home, while others belonged at the office. Just before sunset, another unexpected visitor appeared. It was Mr. Alvarez, who who lived 2 houses farther down the street. He carried a small container of homemade salsa and apologized for arriving late. "I heard what happened," he said. "Honestly, I almost came over earlier, but I figured the officers had everything under control." I nodded. They did. He looked toward Victoria's house before lowering his voice. "You know, this is not the first time she has called emergency services over something that turned out to be nothing." I listened without interrupting. "A few months ago," he continued, "she reported teenagers for supposedly vandalizing the community entrance. Turned out they were volunteers planting flowers with permission from the neighborhood association. Last year, she reported a landscaping crew because she thought they were trespassing. They were working under contract for the city. Several nearby neighbors quietly confirmed they remembered those situations. Nobody spoke with anger. They simply described ordinary events that had been misunderstood or exaggerated. I made a mental note not because I intended to pursue anything personally, but because patterns sometimes become relevant through normal administrative review. I also reminded myself that every report deserves to be judged on its own facts. Assumptions, even repeated ones, should never replace evidence. As darkness settled across the neighborhood, the last of our guests headed home. My father helped me stack the empty tables while my daughter gathered paper plates for recycling. The evening air had cooled enough that the backyard finally felt peaceful again. Across the fence, Victoria's house remained unusually quiet. The lights were on, but the curtains had been drawn. I could not know what she was thinking, and honestly, it was not my place to guess. My responsibility had ended the moment I chose to let the responding officers do their jobs without interference. Still, I had a feeling the story was not over. The incident report would become part of the public record, and if there truly had been similar calls in the past, any future review would be based on documented facts rather than opinions. For now, though, I looked around at the empty chairs, the fading sunset, and the family beginning to clean up together, realizing that the greatest victory of the day was not proving anyone wrong. It was proving that calm, patience, and fairness could outlast even the loudest accusations. Monday morning felt almost unreal after everything that had happened over the weekend. The barbecue had ended peacefully, the guests had gone home smiling, and life appeared to settle back into its normal rhythm. I arrived at police headquarters before sunrise, parked in my usual space, grabbed a cup of coffee, and started reviewing the weekend reports just as I always did. I deliberately skipped the report connected to my own address. Department policy required transparency whenever an incident involved an employee, especially a command officer, and I intended to let the established administrative process work without my involvement. About an hour later, the watch commander stopped by my office with a professional smile. "Chief, I just wanted you to know the documentation has already been forwarded through the normal review process." I nodded. "Good. Keep everything exactly the way it would be for anyone else." He smiled. "That was always the plan." That simple exchange mattered more to me than most people would ever realize. Public confidence is earned when procedures remain consistent regardless of titles. Around lunchtime, I attended a routine staff meeting covering community outreach events, traffic safety, and emergency preparedness. Not a single person mentioned my neighborhood. Everyone understood that personal matters should never distract from serving the public. Meanwhile, something entirely outside my control was beginning to happen. Because every emergency call generates documentation, the city's communications division conducted its standard quality review. That review was not created because of me, nor because of Victoria. It was simply part of the department's ongoing effort to improve response accuracy and identify patterns that might require additional training or public education. Late that afternoon, the communications supervisor requested several previous calls connected to the same address for comparison. That request followed ordinary policy whenever similar calls appeared within a certain period. No assumptions were made. No conclusions were drawn. The purpose was simply to verify consistency and ensure resources were being used appropriately. I did not participate in that review, and I intentionally avoided asking questions about it. If I expected every other resident to respect the process, I had to do exactly the same. Back in the neighborhood, life continued moving forward. My wife later told me that Mrs. Henderson had stopped by with fresh blueberry muffins, joking that she hoped the next neighborhood gathering would involve fewer patrol cars and more pie. Mr. Alvarez laughed and suggested organizing a community cookout before summer ended so everyone could get to know each other better. Hearing those stories reminded me that one difficult afternoon had not defined our street. Kindness still outweighed conflict. On Wednesday evening, I arrived home to find my daughter watering flowers near the front porch. She smiled when she saw me. "The neighborhood feels different now," she said. "Different how?" I asked. "People actually stopped to talk instead of just waving from their cars." I looked around and realized she was right. Two families were chatting while walking their dogs. Another neighbor was helping an elderly couple carry groceries inside. Sometimes difficult moments encourage people to reconnect in ways they had forgotten. As I carried my briefcase inside, my phone buzzed with another message from the watch commander. This one was even shorter than the last. "Administrative review complete. Everything handled according to policy." There was no celebration attached to that message because none was necessary. The purpose of the review had never been to prove someone right or wrong. Its purpose was to confirm that established procedures had been followed correctly from beginning to end. That evening, while taking the trash bins back toward the garage, I noticed Victoria standing near her mailbox. For the first time since the barbecue, she did not avoid looking in my direction. We stood about 30 feet apart in complete silence. After a brief moment, she gave a small nod. It was not an apology, and I did not expect one. It was simply the first acknowledgement that neither of us needed another argument. I returned the nod with the same quiet respect. Sometimes rebuilding a neighborhood begins not with dramatic speeches or courtroom victories, but with two people choosing not to create another unnecessary conflict. As I walked back toward my front door, I realized the most important lesson from the entire experience was never about authority. It was about allowing truth to emerge through patience, evidence, and fairness, because those principles remain dependable long after emotions have faded. Over the next several weeks, our neighborhood quietly became the kind of place I had hoped it could always be. The memory of flashing patrol lights slowly faded, replaced by children riding bicycles after dinner, neighbors waving from their front porches, and families spending more time outside enjoying the warm evenings. Life had returned to normal, but it was a better version of normal because people had learned something valuable without anyone needing to win an argument. One Saturday morning, I was trimming the hedges along the front walkway when I noticed Victoria walking down the sidewalk carrying a small package that had been delivered to the wrong address. She paused near my mailbox for a moment before walking toward me. "This was left at my house by mistake," she said, holding out the box. "I thought you would probably want it." I accepted it with a smile. "Thank you. I appreciate you bringing it over." She nodded quietly. The delivery driver must have mixed up the numbers. For a brief moment, neither of us spoke. Then she surprised me. "I have been thinking a lot about what happened that weekend," she said. "I should have talked to you before making assumptions." It was not a dramatic speech, and it was not a perfect apology. It sounded like someone simply deciding to be honest. I appreciated that more than carefully chosen words. "We all have moments we wish we could handle differently," I replied. "The important part is learning from them." She gave a small smile before wishing me a good weekend and continuing down the sidewalk. I watched her leave, realizing that respect often begins with one quiet conversation instead of one loud confrontation. Later that afternoon, our family hosted another barbecue. This time, nobody looked nervously toward the street whenever a car slowed down. The children laughed while playing catch across the backyard. My mother prepared far more food than anyone could possibly eat, insisting leftovers were part of every successful family gathering. My father leaned back in his favorite chair with the same peaceful expression I had seen countless times over the years. Mrs. Henderson arrived carrying another homemade pie, and Mr. Alvarez proudly brought fresh salsa again, joking that it had officially become his contribution to every neighborhood celebration. Even a few families we had never spoken with before stopped by for a few minutes just to introduce themselves. The afternoon reminded me that communities are not built through rules alone. They are built through trust, conversations, patience, and the willingness to see one another as neighbors before strangers. Looking back, the most important moment was never when someone discovered I was the police chief. That fact changed almost nothing about the outcome because the officers had already reached the correct conclusion before they knew who I was. They listened carefully, examined the facts, treated everyone respectfully, and followed the same procedures they would have followed for any other resident. That is exactly how public service should work. My position was never the reason my family enjoyed peace that afternoon. The reason was much simpler. Truth does not need special treatment when people are willing to let evidence speak louder than assumptions. Every family deserves to feel comfortable gathering in their own backyard. Every neighbor deserves to be heard with respect. Every emergency call deserves a fair and professional response. Those principles protect every community because they apply equally to everyone, regardless of occupation, background, or circumstance. As I looked around the backyard one more time, listening to the familiar sounds of laughter, clinking glasses, and friendly conversations, I realized the greatest victory from that unforgettable weekend was not proving anyone wrong. It was proving that fairness, patience, and simple human decency still have the power to bring people together. Before this story comes to an end, I would genuinely like to hear your thoughts. If you had been standing in my shoes that afternoon, how would you have handled the situation? Please share your perspective in the comments because respectful conversations help all of us learn from different experiences. And if you enjoy thoughtful stories about fairness, community, and people choosing integrity over conflict, consider subscribing so you can join us for more stories like this in the future.